Hello and welcome to All About the Ancient World. Our channel is dedicated to promoting the voices of early career researchers in studies of the ancient world. This lecture is titled Ducetius, Timolean, and Agathocles, Sicilian Adventurism in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. It focuses on three prominent political figures, or adventurers, from Archaic Sicily. It is presented by Garret Denaro. Garret Denaro recently completed his Masters of Science in Ancient Worlds at the University of Edinburgh in 2023. Previously, he received a Bachelor's of Arts with honors from the University of Connecticut for his thesis Minerva and the Capitoline Triad, a history of cultural exchange in Italy, focusing on the transmission of the goddess Minerva through Greek, Etruscan, Faliscan, and Roman depictions. Garret's research follows cultural exchange and social developments of Italic populations, with his master's dissertation examining the Sicilian figure Ducetius through Greek literary and archaeological lenses. Now, without further ado, please enjoy this lecture all about the ancient world.
Hello everyone, this is my presentation on Ducetius, Timolean, and Agathocles, Sicilian Adventurism in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. These three figures will serve as a nice entry point into the dynamic socio-political world that was Archaic Sicily. Now, Archaic Sicily is the period on Sicily from the 8th century BCE to the 3rd century BCE. This is before the First Punic War and the conquest of the island by the Romans. And in this period, you have a couple of different cultures at play on the island. You have the Greeks, who had colonized the eastern and central portions of the island, with a little bit of a towaway into the western portion of the islands. If you look at the map on the left, you do see the city of Syracuse, which was a Greek city. But the western portion of the island is really home to the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, who had created colonies such as Palermo, Panormos, Malta, and Lilybaeum. The native Sicilian populations, of course, were all present on the island before the arrival of these powers, being Bronze Age populations that existed into the Archaic period and past the Archaic period into the Roman period as well. The western portions housed them, the central portions housed them, and the eastern portions of the islands also housed these native Sicilian populations, meaning that all of these cultures were interacting with one another. So that means that Archaic Sicily serves as a great way to kind of analyze what is going on when it comes to different cultures intermingling and interacting with each other in both negative and positive ways. Of course, that includes trade, warfare, diplomacy, the adoption and appropriation of certain cultural motifs. All of these will be the focus of this presentation and will be factored into the three figures I mentioned earlier in Ducetius, Agathocles, and Timolean. Now, Archaic Sicily is of prime interest to the growing field of post-colonial study. Before World War II, Sicily was a focus of scholarship, but it was mainly on the Greco-Roman world alone. There's little regard for native Sicilian populations, or even the Phoenicians for that matter. We have limited contemporary literary sources regarding native populations. Anything that was done at the time period was done through a Greek or Roman lens, which of course skewed our understanding of these native populations more towards the quote-unquote barbaric side. And archaeology was there, but it could only fill in so many gaps, and in the pre-war period, archaeology was mainly focused on Greco-Roman ruins alone, not native sites or native culture. In the post-war period, however, post-colonialism, which is studying these native populations in their own cultural context, has grown significantly, and we have since then grown our study of the native populations and our understanding of these native populations not only within the Greco-Roman world, but on their own cultural terms. Now, to illustrate the development of scholarship on Archaic Sicily throughout the years, I have four sources on the screen that highlight this change from a pre-war approach to the post-colonial approach. The Western Greeks, the history of Sicily and South Italy from the foundations of the Greek colonies to 480 BC by T.J. Dunbabin, is a pre-war work that really put the native populations of Sicily in the pure Greco-Roman context of being savages, barbarians that needed the enlightenment of the Greeks to be civilizations within their own rights. That, of course, has since changed in the post-war period. That's a very archaic way of looking at these native populations. And now through these other three works, we really understand these populations on their own terms. So Archaic and Classical Greek Sicily, A Social and Economic History by Franco de Angelis, is focusing on Greek Sicily, but natives do pop up in his work. And he has a comprehensive social and economic history of the island, covering the natural wealth of the island, shared by both the Greeks and the native populations, and showing how these groups intermingled, although primarily focused on the Greek aspects of the island. However, colonization and subalternity in classical Greece by Zuchraigel here is really focused on these native populations, not just in Sicily, but in other parts affected by Greek colonization. It's an archaeological approach that looks at the archaeological history of these areas and tries to see how they interacted with the Greek newcomers, what they did, what they took from the Greeks, what they gave to the Greeks, which also included population, since a lot of these native populations would end up being part of these wider Greek poli that popped up on the island and in other places, as well as warfare, colonial developments, things that negatively affected these populations as well. Now, the Tamar Hodos piece here on the right, Local Responses to Colonization in the Iron Age Mediterranean, works in the same way as colonization subalternity in classical Greece does. But I did just want to highlight it because, again, archaeology is very huge for us in understanding these native populations, since they did not really leave a literary history in their own right as the Greeks and as the Romans did. Now, I would like to add to this scholarship by focusing on three specific figures. The native Sicel Cucetius from the 5th century BCE, who was a Sicel leader who founded his own native confederation. The Greek democrat Timolean, a 4th century BCE figure who helped unite Western Sicily under his control in a bid to stave off Carthaginian influence. And the Greek tyrant Agathocles, a later 4th century BCE figure who took over the city of Syracuse in the eastern portion of the island and really made himself hegemon of eastern Sicily against the Carthaginians and against the natives, as well as against other Greek cities as well. The aim here is to show that the socio-political climate of pre-Roman Sicily was not ethnically centric, meaning not one culture was dominant. Native and Greek populations could manipulate the dynamic situation to their liking through the template of a Sicilian adventurer, which will be explained throughout this presentation here. Key terms to keep in mind are subalternity/subalterned, which refers to the non-elite populations of areas that are highlighted by either archaeology, contemporary literary sources, modern scholarship, or a combination of the three. Subalternity forms the backbone of a lot of post-colonial scholarship. Another term is Hellenization/Hellenize. This refers to the adoption of Greek cultural motifs by elite populations. It's a very complicated term because the rate of Hellenization amongst different areas is different. We're not sure if it was consistent across the board. In some areas, it may have been just elite populations, of which we have literary sources for. In other areas, it may have filtered down to the local level as well. A full discussion on Hellenization is beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's important to keep in mind. The Sicilian Adventurer refers to the political fragmentation of Sicily and subsequent domination of such spheres by military strongmen, these Sicilian adventurers. And this was not lost on contemporary writers nor on modern scholarship. Diodorus Siculus was a native Sicilian who had a keen interest in the development of strongmen on the island. Sicily was home to many wars. There was 8 Sicilian wars between Syracuse and other Greek powers and the Carthaginians. There was, of course, the Punic Wars, and eventually there was also conflict amongst native groups and Greek settlers. Postcolonial scholarship focuses on how potential independent actors of native, elite, and non-elite populations could interact and develop in this setting and share development across cultural lines. And these Sicilian adventures are 3 nodal points of data that we can look at to see how these shared developments occurred, particularly in urban development, military prowess, and Sicilian identity. Now, moving forward, we'll first talk about the primary sources that serve as the backbone for our study of Archaic Sicily in this presentation. We'll then dive into Archaic Sicily itself in more detail, talking about the native populations, the Greek colonization of the island, and the political instability that was inherent within the island. We will then move on to our three Sicilian adventurers, that being Ducetius, Timolean, and Agathocles in that order. We'll then discuss what makes a Sicilian adventurer and how all three of these individuals fit the template that I provided earlier, and then we will settle with some concluding remarks. Now, the main sources that I am working with are Thucydides, Diodorus Siculus, and a little bit of archaeology. Thucydides was an Archaic period writer writing on the history of the Peloponnesian War, which was the big war between the Spartans and the Athenians in the later part of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. In the 5th century BCE, the Athenians invaded the island as part of this war, and to preface this invasion, he mentions the origins of the native populations on the island and features them as actors despite not being named characters themselves, but as a population group in totality. He is a profoundly analytical historian, so even brief data points that he provides are invaluable for us to try and understand a population that does not have a literary corpus of their own in the native Sicilians. Diodorus Siculus, the main source for this presentation, was a native Sicilian Greek historian, although from a much later period, who wrote the Library of History, a massive universal history that begins around the 11th century BCE and ends with Julius Caesar's rise to power in 59 BCE. Being Sicilian, his native island features heavily in the story. However, he rarely mentions the native populations his Greek heritage shared the island with unless it fits into his broader narrative on historical Greek and Roman figures and Greek and Roman history. Fortunately, he includes Ducetius in his narrative as a case study of tyranny, which in Greek terms was the seizure of power by one man within a Greek city. Because he was interested in tyranny, he also focused on Agathocles, who was a tyrant, and Timolean, the opposite of a tyrant, in that he was very democratic. And he is also an excellent source for lost historians we no longer have access to, such as Timaeus of Taraminium and Antander, who was Agathocles' brother and wrote a biography on the man himself. Archaeology will fit minorly into this presentation, but it is important because archaeological context can provide complex details to trends we notice in primary literary sources. For example, I have pictured the Temple of Segesta, which appears to be a Greek temple dedicated to a Greek god, but is in fact within a native Sicilian city. When we discuss the identity of native figures on the island, we can see how the natives could incorporate themselves into the wider Greek world, such as with this temple, and trying to appeal perhaps to a Greek audience by designing a temple in a Greek design. Now we will dive into deeper detail on Archaic Sicily, which again was the island of Sicily from the 8th century BCE to the 3rd century BCE. We'll discuss the native populations featured on the map above, and on Greek colonization, which is featured on the map below. Now, Sicily in the Archaic period was a wealthy home for the native populations, as well as a target for colonization by both the Phoenicians and the Greeks, due to its agricultural wealth and to its central location within the Mediterranean. If you look at the map, you can see that Sicily is in the dead center of the Mediterranean Sea, allowing anyone who has a position on the island to influence trade from Italy to Spain to North Africa to the Middle East and Anatolia. The agricultural wealth of the island was known not just to the native populations, but to the newcomers as well. If we look at the Diodorus Siculus quote on the right, the inhabitants of Sicily, since by reason of the intimate relationship of Demeter and Kore, two Greek gods, with them they were the first to share in the corn after its discovery. Even in Greek mythology, the agricultural wealth of the island was known to the Greeks, and it was in fact the biggest exporter of grain for the Romans after its conquest in the First Punic War, but before the conquest of Egypt by the Romans in the tail end of the BC era. Now, just who are these native Sicilians that the Phoenicians and the Greeks had to contend with once they started colonizing the island? Well, there are three distinct groups that we can identify from the Bronze Age up to the Archaic period and into the Roman period as well. The first was the Elymenians, who inhabited the western end of the island. One of their primary cities was Segesta, home to that Greek-looking temple we saw earlier, And this group primarily had to contend with the Phoenicians who were colonizing the western portion of the island, such as in the city of Motia, which was a Phoenician colony, although they did contend with the Greeks, particularly with the city of Selinus. The second group was the Sicanians, traditionally considered to be the inhabitants of the central part of the island and the original natives of the island as well before the Elymians and later the Sicels. According to Thucydides, they were pushed out by the Sicels after the Sicels crossed over from the toe of Italy into Sicily itself. Finally, we have the Sicels, the namesake of the island, and the population that produced Ducetius. They are traditionally considered to have inhabited the eastern portions of the island after pushing the Sicanians into the central portion of the islands when they crossed over. And they were the primary contenders, natively speaking, with Syracuse, the cities of Timolean and of Agathocles. It's very important to note that two of these three native populations are considered to be foreigners by the Greeks coming over to the island and either by conquest or by travel settling the island. And that is indicative of Sicily being a cultural meeting place in the center of the Mediterranean, where people could come and go and people can come and make a life for themselves. The Elymians in particular had fitted themselves into the Trojan War narrative, according to Thucydides here with the quote, "After the fall of Troy, some of the Trojans escaped, where they settled next to the Sicanians and were called by the name of Elymi." The Trojan War is the most important myth to the Greeks, and the fact that the Elymians are able to fit themselves within that narrative just shows how the Elymians and how native populations could be taken seriously by the Greeks, and how the native populations themselves potentially could have incorporated themselves into the wider Mediterranean world. All three of these populations had to contend with the Greeks and with the Phoenicians, and since they outnumbered the coming colonizers, they had to interact with them in positive aspects, becoming part of their economies, part of their cities, part of their populations, and having to be negotiated with on equal terms. And nothing highlights this negotiation on equal terms between the newcomers and the native populations than the comings of the Greeks themselves. The main city that will be a part of this presentation is Syracuse, which was founded in the 8th century BCE, and according to Thucydides, was founded when the hero Archias drove out the native Sicilians from the area. However, Heblea Megara, which is another Greek colony on the island, was founded by a deal between newcoming Greeks and a king of the Sicels in that area. Zankel, or Messina, was originally founded by pirates, according to Thucydides, but was home to a mixed population both of Greeks and native populations that were already present on the island. All of these cities had to contend with one another. All of them also traded with one another. All of them tried to take advantage of the trade networks that Sicily was a part of, trying to facilitate trade with the southern Italian Greek colonies and other southern Italian populations. The Etruscans in modern-day Tuscany were one of the preeminent Italic groups before the Roman period. They lived in a series of city-states that were independent, minus a loose coalition called the Dodecapolis in modern-day Tuscany, although they were also influential in Romagna and modern-day Campania in southern Italy. This was a huge Italian market that the Greek cities of Sicily tried to manipulate and to try to really get ahead in to make a lot of money. All this competition was also included in the internal politics of these cities. Syracuse was constantly in and out of political institutions, going from tyranny back to democracy, back to tyranny. Messina was ruled by a tyrant named Anisilus from Calabria, modern-day Calabria, and the Syracusan tyrants also pushed out other Greek cities such as Heblea and Megara. Warfare was endemic to the island, especially with no overarching polity to keep the peace, so competition was heavy and fighting was fierce. This history of colonization, this history of trying to take advantage of the island for oneself or for the benefit of a city, the positive interactions and negative interactions, including warfare between colonizing groups and native populations, all of this can be summed up in the three adventurers, Ducetius, Timolean, and Agathocles. Chronologically, the first of these figures is Ducetius, who was active from 461 BCE to 440 BCE. He was a native Sicil from the city of Menae, and one of the aristocrats from that city. And he first pops into our narrative in Diodorus Siculus, aiding the Syracusans in the siege of the city of Catania. He assists Syracuse. Syracuse wins the day, and himself and Syracuse portion out the land amongst themselves. Now, after Catania, we can view Ducetius through the lens as a native Sicil and the lens as a Hellenized Sicil. As a native Sicil, he founds the city of Pelice around the important cult site of Sicil gods named the Pelici in 453 BCE. He also unites the Sicils around him into one confederation for the use of strong arming and diplomacy, and he founds his home city of Menae on a plain off of its more defensible hilltop as a sign of power. He backs up this power statement by defeating a Syracusan army at the city of Etna in 451 BCE. The Hellenized bit of his personality comes after his loss at the Battle of Nome, where his power base completely slips away from him. He is Hellenized enough and understands the Greeks enough to claim asylum at Syracuse itself in a temple, and in his speech is able to convince the Syracusans to exile him to Corinth, which was Syracuse's mother city. At Corinth, after spending a little bit of time in exile, he is able to convince the Corinthians in another speech, and through the use of an oracle, to return to Sicily and found a joint Sicil-Greek city named Calacte, which he inhabits until his death. This leads us to Timolean, who is active from 346 BCE to 337 BCE. He comes to the island after being sent away from Corinth over the murder of his brother, who was attempting to become tyrant of Corinth, and he killed him over that. He comes to Syracuse, takes control, and becomes general of their armies against the Carthaginians, who they were at war with at the time. He quickly finds allies, including the tyrant Marcus. He secures Syracuse and defeats the allied Carthaginian tyrant Hicetas, another Greek who was allied with the Carthaginians. And he secures the autonomy of other cities, in that he goes to these cities and through strong arming or through diplomacy makes them join his federation as democracies. He also patronizes the cult of the native god Adranos, which draws natives to his cause as well. The culmination of his campaign is at the River Chrysimus, where outnumbered and outgunned, he is able to defeat the Carthaginians in a crushing victory that leads to their capitulation, as well as the capitulations of other Greek cities on the island. Now, despite being the champion of Greek democracy on the island of Sicily, Timolean used some more tyrannical methods to ensure democracy across the island. That included plundering other cities and towns in order to fund his army, which mutinied every once in a while. He also had unilateral control to restructure Syracusan democracy in any way he wished. And that power extended to other cities that joined his confederation, where he also unilaterally restructured them into democracies. He also had forced population movements by bringing in new Corinthian settlers and pushing out other individuals who were not beholden to his ideas for the future of Greek Sicily. Now, Timolean passes away peacefully, leaving democracy in Syracuse as the political institution. Attempting to take advantage of this power vacuum with Timolean gone was Agathocles, a contemporary of Timolean's and most likely part of Timolean's army. He was the son of a potter granted citizenship by Timolean around 343 BCE. He marries a wealthy heiress, climbs the ranks of the army, and eventually tries to seize power in Syracuse and become a tyrant. This doesn't work, and he is exiled to Italy, where he participates in the wars of southern Italy as a mercenary. He returns, and using a combination of deceit, repression, and persecution, takes control of Syracuse. He has a brief struggle with the Syracusan named Acrotatus, who, like Timolean, wanted to restore democracy, but that attempt fails. He then goes on the warpath, trying to make the other Greek cities in his area bow to him. Carthage steps in and mediates a peace, and all the cities in the east that were of Greek nature fall to Agathocles, leaving the west with Carthage. This tenuous situation leads to war, as war erupts with Carthage, and at the Battle of Himera, Agathocles is defeated, and he has to run back to Syracuse and try and keep control on his power as more Greek tyrants, Greek cities flip to Carthage, and he is hemmed in at Syracuse. This leads to the African campaign, which Agathocles is known most for. In 310 BCE, he sails to Africa. He allies with the king of Cyrenaica, Ophelus. He then kills Ophelus and takes his army, and in a series of battles in Africa, manages to take portions of the North African coast. Ultimately, though, this fails and he does have to retreat, but he is able to remain in Syracuse as tyrant for a long number of years, passing away in 289 BCE, with democracy being restored upon his death on his wish. Now that we are familiar with our three adventurers, it's time to discuss how each of them fit the mold of a Sicilian adventurer. Now, the first thing the Sicilian adventurer is able to take advantage of is cities and Greek polises, and either founding new ones or restructuring current cities into versions more pliable to their needs. Ducetius, of course, is able to do this with refounding Menae, as well as founding the city of Calacti, which was both a joint Greek-Sicil venture. He did also have the sanctuary of the Pelici and the city of Pelice that he founded as well too. Timolean unilaterally refounded Syracuse and other cities in his confederation to make them democracies and loyal to him and his cause. And Agathocles did the same thing on the opposite end of the spectrum by making sure these cities were completely cowed in their political power and subservient to him through deception and elimination of elites that were hostile to him. Second, we have military prowess. The Sicilian adventurer had to be very capable militarily speaking to maintain his power base. Ducetius was able to do this with victories at Catania, Etna, and that allowed him to create his Sicel Federation and strong arm native Sicils into that confederation. And then, of course, he lost that after the Battle of Nome. Timolean had an unblemished military career in Sicily, culminating in the battle at the River Chrysimus, and that allowed him to maintain power until his death. Agathocles, very similarly, was a successful mercenary captain in Italy before coming back to Sicily. He had a successful campaign until the Battle of Himera, and even then was savvy enough to plan and execute an invasion of Africa that did work to an extent. And even when it failed and he was forced to return back to Syracuse, he was still militarily prowess. He had still had enough military prowess and was military capably enough to maintain his power in Syracuse itself until his death as well. Finally, we have the incorporation of native Sicilian identity into the power base of the Sicilian adventurer. Initially, colonization was dependent on the cooperation of the native populations with the incoming Phoenicians and Greeks due to the numerical advantage the native populations had over these newcomers. This led to positive interactions over the centuries that allowed Sicils and Greeks, Sicils and Phoenicians, Phoenicians and Greeks to get used to one another. Our prime example, of course, being the Temple of Segesta brought up earlier, which, despite being in a native city, was of Greek architecture and of Greek construction, allowing the native community to express themselves in Greek motifs. For Ducetius, he refounded Menae as a statement of Sicil pride, along with the foundation of Pelice. Although the joint foundation of Calacti shows that Ducetius was Hellenized and capable enough of navigating the Greek spheres of influence and incorporating them into his power base, into his new power base at Calacti. Timolean spent his time patronizing the native god of Adranos, which worked and allowed him to incorporate natives into his own power base. And Agathocles is the only one that really bucks this trend here. However, he was indiscriminate in his brutal repression of cities and individuals. So to conclude, Archaic Sicily's fragmented political nature, its central location in the Mediterranean, and its wealth of agricultural resources made it a prime target not just for colonization and urban development, but also for political strongmen to attempt to take unilateral control of the island, independent of ethnic identity. It did not matter if you're a Greek, native, or Phoenician, you could attempt to be a Sicilian adventurer. Ducetius, Timolean, and Agathocles used a combination of native incorporation, military prowess, and urban foundation and development to create their power bases and to maintain their power bases. This type of analysis has seen continuous growth in scholarship, and the concept of a Sicilian adventurer can be expanded on with further insight in scholarly development, especially as archaeological sites and excavations continue on the island. For the general audience, though, this is a look into the very interesting and very dynamic nature of Archaic Sicily, and I hope you enjoyed this brief look at Ducetius, Timolean, and Agathocles, and I encourage you to do more research for yourselves and to investigate Archaic Sicily in your own terms. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for watching Ducetius, Timolean, and Agathocles, Sicilian Adventurism in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, presented by Garret Denaro. If you have any questions about the content of this lecture, please leave a comment below. If you like this video and want to see more, click subscribe and make sure to hit the notification bell to get updates for future videos. Also, be sure to check out our website, linked in the description below, and consider following us on social media so that you never miss an update. Finally, if you're an early career researcher and you have an idea for a lecture, please take a look at the call for papers on our website and consider applying today. Our next deadline is March 1st, 2025. We hope you enjoyed learning all about the ancient world, and we'll see you in the next video.